You want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source.
Do it! Do it! Do it!
Do it.
Do it!
Do it.
Do it!
Who is doing it? Do it.
Do it!
All of it.
Do it! Come on! Do it now!
And I will do the rest.
Oh, these cookies!
Put that cookie down! Now!
want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source. what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source. want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source. You want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source. process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source.
Do it. Do it.
Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it.
Do it.
Who is doing it? Do it. Do it. All of it. Do it.
Come on. Do it now.
Now we'll do the rest.
Repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source.
This idea just came to me. It's based off the Bedini Flyback captures idea. So battery A is your source power. Battery B is your load. So is this coil. Together they're in series to negative. You switch it here with a transistor, reed or a Hall switch. Whatever, this could be a damaged battery. As long as it has some continuity, that coil will charge up with that amount of continuity. And once it's disconnected from the circuit, the coil will fly back. And this will become a positive instead of a negative. And it will smack the C battery here. So as this battery loses impedance and gains continuity, this coil will receive more energy, and so will battery C. I personally think and this is the same circuit here, and I drew it out again. So I'm going to explain it this way with the editor. Green, I guess. Well, let's do red. So what happens here is the switch closes, and then when the switch closes, the positive from the battery here will head this way. And let me make sure I got this job right. Correct. Okay. Now it'll head this way. And the 12 volts will hit here, right? It will also hit here. But it won't do anything there, because this negative here, once the switch closes, is appearing over here. So this positive will go through the diode and try to meet the negative through whatever impedance the battery has. that the battery is not super high impedance. You know, mind you, this can be 12 volts, this can be 6 volts, doesn't matter. You probably want to make this battery like 24 volts and this one a lower voltage. That way the positive 24 volts can get pushed through the 12 volt battery to meet its negative when you close the switch. And by traveling that way through the coil, sending 24 volt to a 12 volt battery and through a coil, and then the 12 volt battery and the diode. It will try to meet its negative this way, you know, when the switch closes. There will be a path for the energy to connect from positive to negative through the coil and through the battery. The other battery, when you close the switch, the positive goes through the coil, down this way also, and it's trying to look for its negative, but it's not going to find it this way because it doesn't connect to the negative. It connects back to its positive. So it does absolutely nothing in that direction because it's looking for this negative. This positive is looking for this negative, and it's looking for it through the coil. It might try to look for it through here if it was connected, but it's not. It's just doing a loop around the coil. I don't know what to think of that, but the whole idea behind this thing here is to use this battery's impedance. Let's say you put a battery here that's slightly damaged. You want to bring it back. You use the impedance of that battery and add it to this coil impedance when you energize the system by closing the switch. And then when the switch closes, whatever voltage you put here might need to be a higher voltage. It will go through this coil and through the battery to meet the negative on the other end. And then the switch will open up again, and this coil will invert polarity, and you will have, instead of a plus here and a minus here on the coil, you will now have a minus here and a plus here going up on the coil as flyback, high voltage flyback. And then that flyback path I will show here is coming out the coil. Let's say the coil is flying back in green now. The positive flyback will go into this battery, and the negative flyback will go into this battery, and then the positive flyback up here will go not only into this battery, but it will also go into the other battery. But when the positive flyback hits this battery, it's not really doing anything because the negative flyback is not touching here. But the negative flyback is touching here. So pretty much the bottom battery gets the flyback all by itself. And what happens in the process of energizing the coil before the flyback happens is you send energy through the battery, kind of like the force charge system from Bellini. You send energy through the coil, through the battery, back to its negative in order to charge the coil. So the impedance of this battery is added to the impedance of this coil in the charge cycle. And when you do that, you send energy through the battery also. Therefore, you're kind of force charging the battery in the process of charging the coil at the same time. And then when you disconnect that charge and the switch opens up, the flyback happens again. You know, this becomes a negative now, this becomes a positive. Positive flows, flybacks it doesn't go there. The positive flyback goes this way into this battery. Negative flyback goes this way into the battery. Now the reason I have this diode here, even though it's a high voltage diode, I'm not sure why I have it there. It might not be necessary, but I think I put it there because I thought I was going to block this positive from hitting this negative on the battery. I don't think it matters that I don't think you need this diode here. I don't think it matters that the positive from this battery ends up touching this negative, as so long as the negative from this battery doesn't touch this positive. And I think when this switch closes, this negative here touches this negative, and in order for it to get to this positive, it has to go through the battery's positive terminal to get there. So there might be some leakage or whatever. You know, that might cause some level of shorting. So I don't know. It's an experiment. You see here is an experiment. Flyback experiment. You're welcome to modify this any way you want. Try it without the diode. See if it performs differently. But yeah, I just thought I'd like to explain that this system here. Got a nice idea here. Only way to make sense of it is to draw it. So you have a single core of iron. And you have two windings. They can be, different turns, different gauge, but they have to be the same. The opening of the winding has to fit the core of both windings, the same core. And so you have A is your drive winding, the one that gets energized. B is your stator winding, the one that collects the power from the core, the iron core. And you're wondering how's it going to do that? Well, here's the idea. Let me choose a color for this. The spring is in green. So there's a spring halfway through, or like right here, maybe up to here, there's a spring inside this coil. You could also use magnets to do this if you want. But for now, we'll call it a spring. And there's a spring inside the stator coil. Right about there. And of course, the two windings in the core, they can be spaced however you need to space them. Perhaps you have to put the core, halfway in and halfway in the other one to get this to work. This is just a conceptual idea. But for now, let's just look at it like this. And so, let me step back here. And let me redraw this coil a little closer. Maybe we'll put this coil here. Okay, that's your drive coil, and that is coil A. It's coil A. coil B, collector coil, and the core is C. So when you energize A, it's going to push C into B. And the spring is going to be positioned so that when C enters B, the spring pushes the C back towards A in the default position. A has no spring. The core moves via the control of energizing that coil, like a solenoid. And so now, in green, I'll do the wiring. So this coil is wound clockwise. So that means, you put you give the battery plus here, battery minus here. The energy will go from plus to minus. And your north field will be here. And you can push the core that way into the coil B. And the flux inside that core is carried with it into coil B and deposited into coil B, where you collect it with a rectifier of some sort, however you want it, full bridge, half bridge, whatever. And that's just going to a battery or whatever to be charged. And that's that, And so back to coil A, when you energize it to move the core into B, to send the flux that was put into C, the core, and deposit that flux into B. I don't know, man. This may have been invented already. I have no idea, but it's an idea, and I'm just putting it down here. But what I'm saying is here, we'll draw the circuit for the flyback collection of coil A. So this would be your battery power going into the coil. Your source power. And this side will become a negative and this side will become a positive in the flyback. And to do that, you put connect the circuit here with a diode facing that way. Let me go back to orange. And your negative flyback can go that way, and then your positive flyback would go the other way, Yeah, and of course you're going to have to switch these two terminals with a double pole, double throw relay. Let me draw that a little better. Because you don't want to cancel your flyback. So you switch the orange, the power to the coil with the double pole, double throw relay. How do I draw this? Yeah, you switch it right there. Double pole switch the feed. Just do it like that. Yeah. So there's your two switches controlling the power to the coil with a double pole, double throw relay, and you collect the flyback by wiring two diodes, high voltage, into the circuit in purple. And you see that the high voltage diode pointing at the plus terminal of the battery is blocking the battery from feeding the coil in that direction. But it's not blocking the flyback, and the flyback's in purple. That's the flyback polarity. So you can see that polarity is not being blocked, and that's how it goes. But as long as you switch with two poles, this will work just fine. And the flyback will return to the source battery. You'll conserve power in that regard when energizing the coil A to move the core into coil B. The flux carried from the core C is deposited into coil B. Again, you can put as many turns on B and change the gauge, whatever you want to do for the stator size. That's nothing is set in stone here. This is just a concept idea, and I hope it made sense. And I will refine this drawing at a later date. Thanks for watching, guys.
You want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source.
I was looking at this double pole switching setup on a single battery, and some concerns arose, and I thought about it and I said, do I need to test this out, or did I already do that? Because I don't want to go replicating something to test something out just because I had a concern. If I already did test it out in another system. So the concern was, of course, you close both the switches and energize the coil when you close them together with a double pole, double throw relay. Coil gets energized with a plus on this end, a minus on this end. Then you open up the switches, and the plus turns to a minus, the minus turns to a plus, the coil flies back. And it flies back, the minus goes this way, and the plus goes this way. The concern was, are these two switches going to open fast enough to prevent, for example, this minus flyback? If that switch doesn't open fast enough, the minus can reach over here. And if it does, the plus flyback will cancel the flyback by reaching over to here. This will cancel the flyback if, per se, one of these two switches on the double pole, double throw relay is not opening fast enough. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, that's a valid concern. Do I need to test out this concern and replicate it and verify it? Thankfully, no. I'm going to play a video that shows you that this is not happening and that the switch is opening up fast enough. And it's not a concern at all. A video where I did test this out, this very system here. Give me 1 second to present it. I'm going to play that video in just a second. And you'll see that there's not only is there no concern in that happening, but there's actually a voltage rise, which confirms that the flyback is not getting canceled, and it's actually being received across the battery terminal. So the starting battery voltage here was 12.42 volts, and I turned it on already, and it's pretty much wired up the same way with double pole, double throw switching. If one of the switches did not open up fast enough, the flyback would cancel. You would not see a voltage rise, as you see here. So that's the purpose of this brief interruption. To clarify, that concern is not a concern. So, no need for me to replicate this to verify if the switch is opening up quick enough. I already did it in this video. It just didn't occur to me at the time that the concern arose.
Modern data processing systems like these use thousands of magnetic cores. These cores are small, rugged, and they consume less power than most of the other devices that are used in these systems. You'll also find magnetic cores in automatic equipment employed for communication, fire control, cryptography, and high-speed computation. What are magnetic cores? They are tiny rings of nickel alloy or other magnetic materials. They have replaced vacuum tubes for many important functions in data processing systems. Cores come in a variety of sizes and in two basic types. The ferrite type of core is molded from compounds that magnetize easily and is used to provide data processing systems with their memories. The metallic ribbon type consists of a non-magnetic spool wound with a thin ribbon of highly magnetic alloy. This type is used in operating circuits of ADP systems. Both types of magnetic cores are remarkably adaptable to the language of data processing. Many ADP systems use the binary system of numbering, which employs just two digits, 0 and 1. These two digits are called binary digits, or bits for short. A bit is either a 0 or a 1, nothing else. Why do we use binary? Because a bit can be represented by any bistable device, and a magnetic core is a bistable device. Bistable, because it can be magnetized in two directions. When the magnetic lines of force point in one direction around the core, they are a positive magnetic flux, and the core is said to hold a binary 1. If the direction of magnetism is reversed, the flux becomes negative, and the core holds a binary 0. However, remember that this arbitrary definition of positive magnetic flux representing binary 1 and negative magnetic flux representing binary 0 may be reversed in some systems. So far, we've been establishing the function of magnetic cores. They store binary digits, or bits, 0 or 1. Now we're going to see how they do it, and also how they transfer bits from one core to another. To explain how cores store binary digits, we must know how they are constructed. Around the core is wrapped a conductor. Current flowing through the winding produces a magnetic field around the conductor. Because the core is made of highly permeable material, it forms a path for the magnetic lines of force. Because it is ring-shaped, the path it forms is a closed loop. The conductor here is wound so that current flowing in this direction produces a positive flux, setting the core in the binary 1 state. Current flowing in the opposite direction produces a negative flux, which sets the core in the binary 0 state. To show the polarity of the winding in a core diagram, we mark one side with a black dot. By definition, current that flows into the winding from the dot side sets the core to 0. Current flowing into the non-dot side sets the core to binary 1. Remember, non-dot current for 1 and dot current for 0. Any winding around the core obeys the laws of electromagnetism. The magnetizing force it exerts is proportional to the amount of current flowing through it, measured in amperes, times the number of turns in the coil. Or, as it is usually expressed, the ampere turns. Since the number of turns in this winding is constant, we can simplify the rule here. The magnetizing force exerted by the winding on the core is proportional to the winding's current. Suppose we increase the amount of current. Will the total magnetism of the core also increase? It will, but not proportionately, as we'll see on this graph. We're going to take a minute and trace the magnetization curve of a core, because in this way we can point up some of the characteristics that make cores so useful. We measure the magnetism of the core in terms of its flux density, which is the number of magnetic lines of force per square inch. The horizontal axis will represent the magnetizing force of the winding. Remember that the magnetizing force is the cause and the flux density is the effect. Initially, a relatively small amount of magnetizing force produces a relatively high flux density. The curve on the graph will begin like this. But as we increase the magnetizing force, the curve flattens out because we are adding proportionately less to the flux density. Further increases in magnetizing force will have no appreciable effect on the flux density. The symbol for magnetizing force is the letter H. The symbol for flux density is the letter B. The relationship between magnetizing force and flux density for any given core material is represented by its BH curve. This is the point of saturation. The core is holding just about all the magnetism it can hold. We've been applying a positive magnetizing force here, which produced a positive flux density and brought the core to a state of positive saturation. If we now reduce or stop the magnetizing force, for all practical purposes, there is no change. The core material retains most of its magnetism. Here's how we plot this fact on the graph. The BH curve is brought back to the zero line on the horizontal scale. Watch the difference in flux density on the vertical scale near the plus B. It's negligible. This, then, is the amount of remaining magnetism. This amount is known as the residual magnetism of the core material. The magnetism that remains after the force that brought it about is removed. When non-dot current sets the core to the binary 1 state, the residual property keeps it that way, indefinitely. Suppose there is a second pulse of non-dot current. It will have no practical effect on the core because the core is already saturated with positive magnetism. But if we send current through the other way, into the dot side of the winding, then, of course, the core's state will change. To plot the effect, we'll extend our graph. With dot current, we're applying a negative magnetizing force represented by minus H. Negative flux density is symbolized by minus B. We need a certain amount of negative magnetizing force to overcome the existing positive residual magnetism in the core. The amount needed is called the coercive force. At this point, the material contains no magnetism. The flux density is 0. Adding more negative magnetizing force produces a negative flux density. and again the core is brought to a state of saturation, negative saturation. If we reduce or stop the magnetizing force now, there will be little effect on the flux density of the core. The BH curve returns to zero on the horizontal magnetizing force scale, but it remains at almost the saturation level on the vertical flux density scale. In other words, there is residual magnetism in the negative direction too. Therefore, when dot current is fed into the core, magnetism builds up and the core is set to binary zero. Residual property keeps it there. To switch the core, we apply a positive magnetizing force. Enough first to cancel out the negative residual magnetism. That is, to act as a coercive force in the opposite direction. And then, by adding more positive magnetizing force, we can bring the core material back to a state of positive saturation. We have now plotted the positive and negative magnetization of a core. The original S-shaped curve is produced only when we are first magnetizing the core from a completely unmagnetized state. From then on, we're concerned only with the rectangular loop, which tells us the limits of saturation that can be reached with dot and non-dot current. Also, the amount of magnetism that will remain in the core after the current stops. The word hysteresis comes from a Greek verb meaning to lag behind. A hysteresis loop, therefore, shows how much magnetism remains behind after the force that produced it is gone. The shape of the loop indicates the ability of a particular core material to retain magnetism. Shallow, rounded loop, low residual magnetism. A core of this type obviously requires less force during a switch from one state to the other. Rectangular loop, high residual magnetism, a greater amount of force needed. If a core with a rectangular hysteresis loop is in the binary zero state, we're going to have to apply a substantial pulse of non-dot current in order to set it to binary 1. A lesser pulse just won't make the switch. Now, how do we get information out of a core? By means of a second winding. Let's follow the transfer of information from input to output. Assume the core is in a state of positive residual magnetism, in the binary 1 state. To change the core to binary 0, we send current into the dot side of the input winding. Dot current switches the core to binary 0, reversing the direction of the magnetic lines of force. If we diagrammed it, we'd see the positive residual field collapse entirely and a negative field build up to saturation. Anytime a magnetic field builds up or collapses across a conductor like this winding, the movement of the lines of force induces a voltage in the winding, and current flows. Observe the direction of current flow, out the top of the winding. The way these two conductors are wound, a pulse of current sent into the bottom of the input winding results in a pulse of current going out of the top of the output winding. We used a dot to keep track of the polarity of the input winding, and a similar dot will establish the polarity of the output winding. This gives us another rule about the dots in a magnetic core diagram. When dot current moves into the input winding, it causes the current to move out the dot side of the output winding, provided the input current produces a change in flux. For example, our core is now set at binary 0, so a second pulse of dot current will have no practical effect. The core is already at the level of negative residual magnetism. There is no change in flux, and therefore no output current. However, if we send current in the opposite way, into the non-dot side of the input winding, the direction of flux in the core is reversed, switching it to binary 1, and produces a current that flows out of the non-dot side of the output winding. To repeat, a non-dot current input results in a non-dot current output. Remember these two rules. Dot current in results in binary 0 and dot current out. Non-dot current in results in binary 1 and non-dot current out. Now suppose we want to send non-dot current into the core, setting it to the binary 1 state, but we don't want to send current out, at least not yet. By connecting in a second core on the right, we can see more clearly what the problem is. Now, the first core's output winding is directly connected to the input of the second core. This input has been wound so its polarity is the same as that of the input of the first core. The dot side is below. In a typical core circuit, current flows in only one direction, into the input of the first core. We'll take the non-dot side for our example. We'll assume that, initially, the left core is set to 0 and the right core to 1. All we want to do is store a binary 1 in the left core. Watch what happens with the circuit as we have it. Current flows into the non-dot side of the first core's input. The first core is switched to 1, as we wanted. But this produces current to flow out of the non-dot side of the first core's output, along the circuit and into the dot side of the input winding on the second core, switching that core to 0, which we did not want. If we are going to control the transfer of information from one core to another, we need something in the circuit that will block the flow of the current, and do it selectively. The device commonly used is a crystal diode, which has a high resistance to current flow in one direction, the back resistance, and practically no resistance at all in the forward direction. Any unidirectional device or arrangement will serve the purpose, and we'll symbolize this with a general symbol for one-direction flow. The arrow points in the direction in which it allows the current to flow. Current coming the other way meets the back resistance of this device and is blocked. With such a device in position in the circuit, the second core is effectively isolated from the first. We'll create the same conditions we had before. The first core is initially set to binary 0, and the second to binary 1. We send non-dot current into the input winding of the first core, switching it to 1. But, due to the back resistance of the electronic device, no current can flow against the arrowhead. No current, no flux change, no change in the second core from binary 1 to binary 0. Thus, we have changed the binary state of the first core and retained the binary state of the second core by the use of this unidirectional device. How can we switch either core to 0? We've said that current flows into the input of the first core on the non-dot side only, and this would be typical in a core circuit. The device will allow current to flow through it in its forward direction only, as we've set it up here. That means that current can flow into the non-dot side of the second core's input, but not into the dot side. What we need for dot current is a shift winding on each core, wound so the dot side is at the left in our diagram. The shift winding shifts or transfers bits from one core to the next, as these two will demonstrate. But we'll complete our diagram first by giving the second core an output winding that is identical with the first core's output. And for this example, we'll assume that both cores are in the zero state. All right, we'll follow the events in their proper sequence. A non-dot input sets the first core to 1. Nothing happens to the second core. Current flow in this direction sets a core to 0, but that's where this core is already. We can hold the binary 1 in the first core as long as we wish. When we're ready to transfer it out, we send a pulse of current into the dot side of the shift winding, and 3 things happen. The first core switches to 0. Current flows out of the dot side of the first core's output through the one-way device and into the non-dot side of the second core's input. And the second core switches to 1. We have now transferred a binary 1 from the first core to the second and controlled the time of the transfer to the exact moment we want it. The binary 1 may be stored here, or again, a shift pulse may be applied to make the transfer to the next core along the line, thus clearing this core back to binary 0. However, there is one final problem to consider here. A shift pulse will induce a voltage not only in the output winding, but also in the input winding. Current will flow out of the dot side of the input back toward the first core. The one-way device won't stop it because it's going around the circuit in the direction it allows. This backward flow of information would, if unchecked, switch the first core, interfering with its operation. It is checked, however, by the design of the output winding. The output winding of the first core has many turns, in contrast to the input winding of the second core, which has relatively few turns. The ratio may be as high as 12 to 1. Consequently, the small current produced in the second core's input meets a high impedance when it flows back to the first core's output. There just isn't enough current to provide the force necessary to switch the first core. We have been diagramming the single diode transfer loop, the simplest and most basic of the circuits that transfer bits from one core to other cores. The diagram we have been building up is a schematic, but there's an easier way to represent these loops. Logical diagrams eliminate the complex details found in schematics by concentrating on what the magnetic core circuit does. Its logic, or reason for being there. Only a few symbols are needed for logical diagrams, and they're easily understood. A circle represents a core. An arrow pointing into the circle is an input. An arrow pointing away, an output. A binary digit inside the core indicates its state, 0 or 1. If the bit is placed in front of an input arrow, it shows the state to which that input will set the core, in this case, 1. A bit placed behind an output arrow means that when the core is switched to this state, an output will be induced. Here the core must be switched to 1 for an output to occur. If we remember that initially the core is either at 0 or 1, we'll see that these arrows and bits tell us 4 things about this circuit. If the core is initially 0, the input switches it to 1, and an output occurs. If the core is initially 1, there will be no switch. Therefore, no output, since there will be no change in the flux of the core. Other symbols used for logical diagrams are just as simple. For example, if we wish to show an input that will set the core to 0 using direct current, the arrowhead is closed. In our discussion, we've been dealing with pulse current, shown by open head arrows. Double arrowheads mean an override input, an input that will hold the core to the indicated state despite the simultaneous presence of other inputs. The letter T is used to designate time. This override pulse will hold the core to 1 at a moment in time identified as T1. Other letters serve to label individual inputs and outputs where several may be present. We can relate an input to an output with the capital and small form of the same letter. Thus here, where the core is initially 0, and input Q comes in at time T1 and switches it to 1, an output occurs. This output is identified by small q. Now let's take another look at the logical diagram of the single diode transfer loop. It gives us the whole story very quickly. An input pulse sets the first core to binary 1, unless it's there already. The core stays at 1 until a shift pulse comes in at time T1 and switches the core to 0. This switch induces an output pulse in the first core's output winding, which causes the second core's input winding to set that core to 1. In effect, a binary 1 has been transferred from the first core to the second, where it's stored until at time T2, another shift pulse clears the second core back to 0. We can draw logical diagrams like this of any magnetic core circuit, and we depend on them for a clear understanding of the work done by the circuit. In this picture, we've been dealing with the basic properties of magnetic cores, memory units, and a variety of operating circuits. Later, you'll be seeing how they work. They've demonstrated their efficiency and reliability in dozens of applications. They conserve space and power. They operate with precision at high speed. In fact, the development of the modern computer has been due in large part to the techniques devised for using these remarkable cores.